Victory does not erase loss, and even in freedom, silence can speak louder than celebration. The second Death Star had fallen. The Empire, wounded, disoriented, retreating, was no longer the galaxy's unshakable shadow. On the forest moon of Endor, fireworks rose above the trees. Ewoks danced. Rebels cheered. The dark had lifted. For the first time in years, hope felt real. But Luke Skywalker stood apart from it all. He did not linger at the celebration. He did not raise his glass. As the flames of victory roared in the night, he slipped into the shadows, quiet, purposeful, and carried the weight of something no one else saw. In his arms lay the body of Anakin Skywalker. Not Darth Vader, not the monster the galaxy feared, but the man, his father, who had found his way back to the light only moments before dying. Luke had watched it all unfold. The lightning in the throne room, the Emperor's rage, the silent plea in Vader's final act of redemption. And when it was over, he had cradled Anakin as the light faded from his eyes. There were no songs for that moment, no medals, just a quiet funeral pyre and the sun who lit it. As the flames consumed the armor, Luke felt the final severance, the last burden of his father's legacy lifted and mourned. Anakin Skywalker had returned, if only for a moment. But for Luke, that moment was everything. He returned to the others before dawn, smiling, quiet, changed. Leia saw it in his eyes immediately. He didn't tell her everything, not yet, but he told her enough, that Vader had saved him, that beneath the mask was a man who once had a name and a soul. When he told her that Vader was their father, she looked away. Her silence spoke of pain and something deeper. Time would be needed for both of them. In the days that followed, the Rebel Alliance began to transition into something new. The New Republic was forming, piecemeal from the rubble of a fallen empire. Worlds that had once been silenced now called for representation. Generals became governors. Fighters became diplomats. And Luke, he watched. He had fought for this freedom, bled for it. But now he stood at a crossroads the others could not see. His war was not over. The Emperor had spoken of things beyond death, ancient powers, secrets lost to time. Luke had felt something deeper stir in that throne room, something cold and vast. The light had won the battle, but the darkness had not died. And so as the galaxy celebrated, Luke Skywalker began his next journey, not as a rebel, but as a seeker. He returned to Dagobah, to the quiet swamp where Yoda had passed into the Force. The ancient hut now lay empty, crumbling under roots and moss. There, Luke meditated, not for answers, but for presence. And then, in the stillness, they came. Obi-Wan, Yoda, and Anakin. Their voices, luminous and distant, filled the space around him, not with words, but with understanding. The Force had not abandoned him. It would guide him still, but the path ahead would be lonely. He asked them if the Jedi should return. He asked if he was ready to teach. He asked if peace would last. Their answers were soft, indirect, the way the Force always spoke. The future is always in motion. A Jedi's strength flows from us, but so too must their wisdom. Trust, but question. Luke took these lessons to heart, and then he began his search for Jedi texts, for forgotten temples, for echoes of a past erased by fire and fear. He did not know where the road would lead, but he knew this. The galaxy would need protectors again. Not warriors, not soldiers, guardians of peace. And so Luke Skywalker walked away from the flame of war into the shadowed corners of a galaxy still healing, searching not for battle, but for balance. When the fire dies down, all that remains is what was buried beneath the ashes. In the months after Endor, the galaxy began to reshape itself. The New Republic slowly formed from the remnants of rebellion. Systems rejoined freely. Former Imperial governors were tried or fled into the unknown. The old symbols fell. Stormtrooper helmets left rusting in the dirt. Imperial flags burned and trampled. But for Luke Skywalker, the battle had only just begun. Not one of armies, not of fleets or sabers, but of memory, of history, of rebuilding what had been lost. Luke had defeated Vader, faced the Emperor, and survived the temptations of the dark side. But he was no Jedi master. There were no living Jedi to guide him. No council, no school, no tradition. He was alone. And so he turned to the stars, not to lead the New Republic, not to sit on any throne, but to search, to uncover the secrets of the Jedi Order that Palpatine had tried to erase. He traveled first to Jedha, a scarred world still weeping from the Empire's cruelty. The city of Nijeda lay in ruins, shattered by a super laser test long before the Death Star's completion. And yet, the Force still clung to the soil like morning dew. The ancient Temple of the Kyber had once stood here, home to Jedi pilgrims, guardians of the wills, and worshippers of the light. Luke wandered the dust and silence. He found fragments of stone, shattered manuscripts, voices buried in the rubble. From Jedha, he followed legends to Ilum, a frozen world sacred to Jedi initiates. The planet, once rich with kyber crystals, had been mined hollow by the Empire, its heart gouged out, its caves repurposed for something darker. One day, it would be reforged into Starkiller Base. But even in its scars, Luke found whispers, echoes of young younglings who had once forged their lightsabers in its icy embrace. On Lothal, he studied temple ruins touched by the world between worlds. On Ossus, he unearthed datacrons buried in sealed Jedi vaults. On Tython, he meditated beneath the twin moons where the ancient Jedi had once begun it all. He followed paths no longer walked, Force nexuses, visions, dreams. He spoke with hermits, seers, historians. Sometimes he found only silence. Other times the Force seemed to answer. Along the way, Luke constructed a new lightsaber. Gone was the blue crystal passed down from Anakin, lost with his severed hand on Cloud City. Now he forged a weapon of his own, green, calm and strong. A symbol not of inheritance, but of choice. He began writing, not doctrine, not rules, but understanding. He tried to piece together what the Jedi had once been and what they had forgotten. For Luke had come to believe something many Jedi had never accepted. The Order's fall was not only Sidious's doing. It had become rigid, dogmatic, isolated from feeling. It had tried to teach power without presence, discipline without compassion. He didn't want to rebuild the Jedi. He wanted to revive them. And yet doubts followed him. Whispers in the Force, memories of Vader's mask, of the Emperor's laughter. What if the Jedi were destined to fall? What if his teaching led only to pain? Even so, he kept searching. He reached out to Leia often. She had begun her own path, helping shape the New Republic's Senate. But the Force still called to her, and Luke offered gentle guidance. She declined to train, sensing that her path lay elsewhere. But she trusted him, believed in him, always. By the second year after Endor, Luke's journey had taken him to a dozen worlds, each one offering pieces of the puzzle, lost names, forgotten techniques, visions of balance, and warnings of darkness. He was not yet a master, but he was becoming something rarer, a Jedi who listened to the past, to the living Force, and to the world around him. The galaxy was healing, and in its quiet corners, Luke Skywalker, child of prophecy, son of fallen legends, was quietly preparing to restore something sacred. Not the Jedi of old, but something better. You do not rebuild the past by stacking its stones. You plant something new and let it grow in its own time. Years had passed since the fires of Endor faded into memory. The galaxy was changing. The New Republic had taken root, establishing a fragile peace in the wake of Imperial tyranny. But Luke Skywalker was not part of the politics that shaped this new government. He remained apart, wandering, watching, listening, and preparing. He had gathered knowledge, scrolls, holocrons, teachings from half-buried ruins and whispered legends. But knowledge alone was not enough. It was time to act. Luke returned to the heart of the galaxy, no longer just a seeker, but a teacher. Quietly, carefully, he began reaching out, looking for others like himself. Not soldiers, not idealists, but Force sensitives. People who could feel the breath of the universe moving through them and might one day be ready to shape it. Some were children, some were older, untrained, confused by their abilities, some were orphans of war. A few were survivors, those who had hidden during the Jedi Purge, now emerging with caution and hope, and so the first seeds were planted. Luke did not seek to recreate the Jedi Temple of Coruscant. He had no golden halls, no sacred council chairs. Instead, he found a quiet place, a hidden world with strong Force energy, peaceful and untouched by war. The name of the planet was lost to most star maps, but here he began the new Jedi school. It was no fortress, just a place to learn and to remember. He taught what he had come to understand, that the Force is not control, it is connection, that fear must be faced, not buried, that compassion is strength, not weakness. He taught them to meditate beneath the stars, to hear the will of the Force in the wind, in water, in one another. He taught lightsaber discipline only when it was needed, and made sure they understood power was not the goal. peace was. Among his first students were those who would come to be known as the Jedi of the New Order, young, idealistic, curious. They called him Master Luke, but he never carried the formality of the old masters. He was more mentor than judge. He encouraged questions. He listened. Leia visited from time to time. She still did not walk the Jedi path, but she encouraged others to do so. Luke offered to train her, but she declined again, her heart too bound to the Senate and to her son. Ben Solo. He was still young, but already strong in the Force, and Luke, in his heart, knew that Ben's path would be the most important and the most difficult. But for now, the Academy flourished. Luke kept no army, he claimed no title, his school was not a symbol of dominance, but of possibility. And the galaxy began to notice. Whispers of the Jedi's return stirred in distant systems. Children with strange dreams began to speak of a man in dark robes with a green lightsaber who stood between light and shadow. Some believed, others feared. Still, Luke taught. He believed the galaxy needed the Jedi, not as warriors but as guardians of balance. He taught that anger must be acknowledged, not denied. That attachments were natural but should not control one's destiny. He diverged from the old Jedi dogma in many ways, seeking a more complete, more human path. He was no longer bound by the rigid codes of the past, and in this openness, his students thrived. They explored Force healing, Force empathy, even deeper spiritual aspects forgotten by the Council of Old. They studied the living Force and the cosmic Force alike. Luke encouraged them to find their own way, to serve the galaxy not through conquest, but through understanding. But even as light returned to the stars, shadows grew. In his meditations, Luke sometimes felt something distant, cold, watching. He couldn't name it, couldn't trace it, but it lingered in the corners of the Force like a breath not yet drawn. He said nothing, not yet. There was still hope, still time. For the first time since Endor, Luke Skywalker felt something powerful blooming around him, an echo of the legacy he had inherited, but now reshaped in his own image. Not the return of the old Jedi, but the beginning of something new. Ben Solo. Some stars shine brightest just before they fall, and some hearts carry both light and fire from the moment they are born. His name was Ben. Born of Leia Organa and Han Solo, he was the child of legacy, of rebellion and royalty, of scoundrel courage and Skywalker power. The Force flowed through him not as a gentle breeze, but as a storm. Luke knew it from the moment he first sensed him. Even as a child, Ben was strong, too strong. Emotions surged in him like waves. Curiosity, anger, love, fear, they came fast and deep before he had the words to explain them. The Force clung to him, but it did not bring him peace. Leia was the first to feel it, and so she turned to her brother, not out of fear, but with hope. Hope that he, more than anyone, could help Ben find the stillness he had never known. Luke agreed, not because he wanted to shape a weapon or control his nephew, but because he believed. He believed that Ben was the future of the Jedi. He believed that if he guided him carefully, gently, Ben would become more than powerful. He would become whole. And so Ben Solo came to the Jedi school. He was older than some of the other students, stronger than most. He took to training quickly. His saber technique grew sharper by the week. His ability to move objects, to see through others, to pierce the veil between present and future, it surpassed even Luke's at that age. But with that talent came weight. Ben was never at ease. Not with the other students, and sometimes not even with Luke. He questioned, he challenged. At times he was withdrawn, retreating into his own head. Other times he was volatile, quick to anger, quick to doubt. Luke tried to reach him. He spoke of balance, of the Force as a river, not a fire. He trained Ben with patience, guiding him through advanced meditations and ancient teachings lost for generations, and Ben tried. He tried to live up to what everyone seemed to expect of him, the son of Leia, the heir of Vader, the student of Skywalker, but the shadows followed him. Whispers crept into his dreams, voices, soft at first, telling him that he was meant for more, that the Jedi feared his power, that even Luke, his own uncle, was holding him back. Luke sensed something, a darkness circling. He began having visions during meditation, brief flashes of destruction, a burning temple. Ben's face twisted with pain and fury. He dismissed them at first. The future was always uncertain, always in motion. He reminded himself of that. But the visions persisted. Sometimes he would wake from meditation with his heart pounding, Sometimes, while training, Ben would look at him with something unspoken behind his eyes. Not hatred, but distance. A wall slowly building. Luke never blamed Ben. He blamed himself. Had he been too soft, too trusting? Had he underestimated the legacy of Anakin Skywalker, the darkness that lived like a sleeping ember in their blood? He spoke to Leia. He told her of his worries. She listened, but her face grew still. "I know what's inside him," she said, "but I also know he's our son. He can choose his path." Luke wanted to believe that. More than anything, he doubled his efforts, trained harder, reached deeper, spent more time one-on-one with Ben, taught him how to meditate in ancient ways, how to reach out into the living force for peace instead of power. But it wasn't enough, because even as Luke poured light into his nephew, the darkness was already reaching in from beyond, a presence. Snoke. Ben had never met him, not directly, but the voice in his dreams was real, and it was old, patient. It told Ben he was destined for greatness, that he had been lied to by Jedi who feared him, that the Jedi way was weakness, and the dark side held his true name. Luke could not hear that voice, not yet, but he felt its weight like a chill in the air. And deep down, he began to fear something he had never dared to believe, that even with all his training, all his knowledge, all his hope, he might not be enough. Ben Solo was not lost, not yet, but the path before him forked. And Luke Skywalker, Master Uncle Jedi, stood at the crossroads, unsure of which path his most precious student would take. Shadows in the Force. The Force speaks in whispers, but some silences are not empty. They are full of watching eyes. By the 7th year of Luke Skywalker's Jedi school, the galaxy had grown quieter. The New Republic was in full bloom. Star systems rebuilt. Children born after the war knew nothing of stormtroopers. Senators spoke of peace with proud certainty. But Luke did not share their ease. Something was wrong. It was not something he could name, not a presence he could point to in the stars. But in the quiet, during his meditations, Luke began to feel a tremor, a dark undercurrent threading through the Force like oil beneath water. It was not a return of the Sith. Not exactly. It was something colder. And more than anyone else, it surrounded Ben Solo. Ben had grown into a powerful young man, graceful in combat, deeply connected to the Force, intelligent, thoughtful, but also increasingly isolated, distant from his peers, restless in his training. Questions once asked with curiosity now came with frustration. He pushed harder in sparring. He sought deeper secrets in old texts. And at night, he dreamed. The same voice over and over calling to him. "You are not who they think you are. They fear your strength. They would rather see you broken than see you rise." Luke could not hear this voice. Not fully, but he felt its weight in the Force, heavier with each passing day. And he began to research, to reach beyond the Jedi records and into more obscure, ancient lore. He studied the unknown regions, a part of the galaxy so uncharted and chaotic that even the Force felt clouded there. That's when he found the name. Snoke. Little was known, only fragments in forbidden texts, whispers in exile logs. A figure who operated in shadows, neither Sith nor Jedi, but steeped in the dark side. A presence older than the Republic, one who spoke of reshaping the galaxy, not through brute force, but through manipulation. Luke realized what was happening too late. Snoke had already found Ben, not in body, but in spirit. He had wormed his way into the boy's dreams, his doubts, his fears. And worse, Ben had listened. Luke began watching him more closely. He meditated on Ben's presence, quietly sensing the tremble in the Force around him. Once, during a sparring match, he saw Ben lose control. Not with rage, but with something colder, focus sharpened into cruelty. He struck down his opponent, not to win, but to punish. Luke stopped the match, alarmed. Ben said nothing. Another night, Luke found Ben standing outside the temple alone, long after the others had gone to sleep. His eyes distant, his voice soft. "Do you ever wonder if the light is lying to us?" Luke tried to guide him back, tried to listen, tried to help him name the pain he couldn't describe. But his heart was beginning to break, because Luke had seen this before, in Anakin, the same brilliance, the same pressure, the same slow erosion of trust in the Jedi. And in that realization came a feeling Luke had never known in all his life as a Jedi. Fear. He feared for Ben, feared what Snoke might be doing to him, feared what he might be forced to do. And with fear came temptation. One night, Luke entered Ben's chamber, not as a master, not as an uncle, but as a guardian seeking clarity. He opened his senses, reached into the Force to see what lingered within Ben Solo. What he saw horrified him. He saw fire, destruction, the temple in ruins, the dead at his feet. He saw Ben, cloaked in black, leading armies, eyes ablaze with hatred. He saw a future twisted beyond anything he had prepared for, and for one brief, terrible moment, Luke ignited his lightsaber, not to strike, not truly, just to think. But the light of the saber woke Ben, and in that instant, just a heartbeat, Luke saw what Ben saw, his uncle, his teacher, his last tether to the light, standing above him with a weapon drawn. Ben screamed, and in that scream, the Force shattered. The walls collapsed, the temple shook, and when the dust settled, Ben Solo was gone. And with him, the Jedi. When the sky split and the temple burned, Luke Skywalker did not fight. He knelt beneath the ruins of everything he had built, stone cracked, wood scorched, the smell of smoke and betrayal in the air, and he did not scream. He simply closed his eyes and listened. The Force was quiet now, as if in mourning. The students he had trained, the hopeful, the curious, the kind, were gone, some dead, some scattered, some perhaps still alive, hiding in fear. He did not yet know. He only knew one thing. Ben Solo had become someone else. The boy he had held as a baby, the student he had believed in, the family he had sworn to protect. Ben was gone, swallowed by a new name, Kylo Ren. The name traveled ahead of him like a shadow. He had fled to the unknown regions. There he would be found by the Knights of Ren, an order not Sith, but bound to the dark side, feral and untrained. He would slay their leader and claim control. He would wear the mask, not to hide, but to bury the last traces of Ben Solo. And Snoke would welcome him, not as a tool, but as an heir. Luke watched it all unfold through the Force, like a wound refusing to close. He saw Kylo begin to hunt down the remaining Force sensitives. He saw the galaxy shudder as whispers of Jedi returned to fear, not faith. The Jedi Order had fallen again, and this time Luke had brought it down with his own hand. He could not forgive himself. He wandered the galaxy in silence, refusing to return to the New Republic, refusing to explain what had happened. He didn't speak to Leia. He couldn't. The weight of what he had done, what he had almost done, was too heavy. How do you face a sister when her son is lost, and you may be the reason? Luke found a remote star chart, something old, something almost mythic, a record of the first Jedi temple hidden on a forgotten world. It was said to be the birthplace of the Jedi Order, the beginning of everything. That is where he went, to the edge of the galaxy, to the edge of the Force, to the edge of himself. Ahch-To was quiet, wind and stone, green cliffs above ancient oceans. Here Luke found the original Jedi texts preserved in a sacred tree. He placed them in a stone library, but he did not read them. Not yet. He was not ready. He stared out across the ocean for days, then weeks, then months. He fished. He climbed. He slept on the cold stone. He sat beside the caretakers, a race of gentle beings who maintained the Jedi structures in silent reverence. He did not speak of who he was, not even to himself. He left his X-Wing submerged beneath the water like a buried sword. He left his lightsaber untouched. He cut himself off from the Force, for he no longer trusted himself to feel it. He told himself the Jedi must end, that their ways led only to pride, to blindness, to suffering. Wasn't that what happened to the Jedi of the Republic? Wasn't that what happened to him? He left a map, fragmented, broken, so that if he was truly needed, just maybe someone could find him. But in truth, he hoped they wouldn't. He wasn't hiding from the galaxy. He was hiding from hope, because hope had asked too much of him. He had tried to be a teacher, a master, a legend, and in the end, he had failed. Or so he believed. The island and the silence. Some disappear into exile. Others vanish into themselves. Ahch-To was older than memory. The sea crashed endlessly against the cliffs, salt wind hissing through stone spires and moss-covered temples. The Jedi had once begun here, not in glory, but in contemplation, in balance. The first steps of understanding the Force had been taken on this ancient green world, and now, in its twilight, Luke Skywalker had returned. He did not arrive with ceremony, no flags, no lightsabers. He came alone, as a man, as a failure, as a name trying to forget itself. Years passed. The island became his world. He tended it with silence. He fished its seas with long spears, climbed its cliffs with hands weathered by wind and time. He watched the caretakers move in their quiet rituals. keeping the old temple structures preserved, not because they believed in the Jedi, but because they remembered that someone once had. Luke did not train. He did not teach. He did not speak to the Force. He cut himself off utterly, not out of hate, but out of guilt. He believed the Jedi had failed. Not only in the past, during the Republic's fall, but in him. He had tried to rebuild their ways, believing he could fix what they had lost. But the more he tried, the more he saw himself becoming part of the same cycle. Pride, power, blindness, collapse. And in the ashes of that collapse, he saw Ben Solo rise. So Luke buried the lightsaber, buried the hope, buried the name. He believed the galaxy would be better without Jedi, without him. But the galaxy was not done with him. One morning, a ship arrived. It came not with war, but with questions. Her name was Rey. She was young, fierce, haunted. She carried a lightsaber she had never built, and a name she didn't understand. She said the Resistance needed Luke Skywalker, that the war had returned, that the spark of rebellion needed its legend. But Luke did not rise. He looked at her and saw a path he had walked before, one he did not wish for anyone else to tread. He told her to leave, refused the saber, closed the door of the temple behind him, but Rey did not leave. She followed, trained alone, asked again, pleaded, not just for herself, but for others, for Leia, for the galaxy. And slowly, something began to move in Luke. Not trust, not yet, but memory. He watched her train on her own, watched her fight against herself, her pain, her anger, her desire to belong. He remembered what it was to be alone, to be afraid. He remembered Yoda, Obi-Wan, the people who had believed in him even when he did not believe in himself. So he gave her something, not the old Jedi code, but the truth. He taught her 3 lessons. The first, what the Force truly is. Not a power to be wielded, not a weapon, but a balance, a breath between all things. Life, death, light, dark, a connection, not a command. The second, the failure of the Jedi, that they allowed Darth Sidious to rise, that they trained Anakin, who became Vader, that they served politics, not the Force. And the third, that strength alone was not enough, that facing the darkness required understanding, not just rejection. But Rey, despite her growth, challenged him. She believed he was wrong, that the Jedi must return, that the light must be fought for. Luke didn't know if she was right. And then he sensed it. Ben. Not as a distant shadow, but as a presence touching Rey's thoughts. Snoke had bound them, mind to mind. And Rey saw something in Ben that Luke no longer could. She left Ahto, believing she could bring him back, just as Luke once believed in Vader. Alone again, Luke returned to the temple. Conflicted, silent. He watched the firelight flicker against the ancient Jedi tree, and there, the past arrived. Yoda. The old master appeared in the rain, his spirit luminous, his voice as wise and strange as ever. He saw Luke's pain, saw his indecision, and with one gesture, he summoned lightning from the sky and set the tree ablaze. Luke gasped. The sacred texts, but Yoda only smiled. Page-turners, they were not. He reminded Luke that failure is the greatest teacher, that wisdom is not clinging to what was, but having the courage to guide what may yet be. And in that firelight, something stirred in Luke Skywalker again. Not pride, not power, but clarity. A legend does not live in power, it lives in choice. The fire had gone out, the resistance was dying. Leia, broken and grieving, watched her people fall back to a forgotten outpost on the mineral world of Crait. The First Order pressed in with merciless precision, led by the hand she once cradled in childhood, her son, now Kylo Ren, and Luke Skywalker, her brother, had vanished until he returned. Not as the man Rey had first found, not as the weary hermit burdened by failure, but as something else, something quiet, something clear. He arrived alone. His robes were fresh, his hair darker, his beard trimmed, his saber, Anakin's saber, hung at his side. He looked like the Luke the galaxy remembered. But this was not a return to form. This was a choice. He spoke to Leia softly, kneeling beside her in the shadows of a dying resistance. No apologies, no explanations, just presence. No one's ever really gone, he told her. Then he stepped outside, onto the salt plains of Crait, before 1,000 blaster cannons, before a man who had once been his student. Kylo Ren, the First Order rained fire down upon Luke's silhouette. Blasters shrieked, earth scorched, but when the smoke cleared, he was still standing, untouched. Kylo descended, sabers drawn, face twisted in rage. He screamed, charged, struck, and Luke dodged, gracefully, effortlessly, never raising his blade to kill. He wasn't there to win. He was there to distract, to give the resistance time to escape, to give hope one more chance. Each movement of his blade was poetry, a dance, not of aggression, but of clarity, of resolve. He was not there to defeat Kylo. He was there to remind him, "I'm sorry, Ben, I'm not here to save you." The final strike came. Kylo pierced him through, but Luke stood, smiling, because Kylo had not struck a man. He had struck a projection. Luke's body was still on Ahch-To, seated in meditation above the sea. He had done what no Jedi had ever done, bridged the galaxy with the Force, not to destroy, but to inspire. On Crait, the Resistance escaped. Across the galaxy, the legend of Luke Skywalker was reborn, not as a warrior, but as a symbol, a single man standing before the darkness, not with hate, but with peace. And on Ahch-To, Luke breathed. The effort had taken everything from him. His body trembled, his vision dimmed. But as he looked out across the sea, he saw the twin suns rising, just like Tatooine, just like that first moment long ago when a farm boy looked out and wondered who he might become. Now he knew. He smiled and became one with the Force. His body faded. His spirit remained. Not broken, but finally, free. This chapter, Explore Luke's final act, ignited a new spark in the galaxy and in one young woman who carried his legacy forward. Haratnyan, the spark that survived. Bart, legends are not born in victory. They are born when one soul chooses to stand alone, so others may rise. Across the galaxy, the story spread. It passed from world to world like a breath, like a song. No one knew how it had happened, only that it had. A man, a Jedi, had faced down the First Order alone, had stood before an army and lived. Luke Skywalker, the last Jedi, had returned, and then was gone. But in his absence, something strange began to happen. Children in the Outer Rim drew his likeness in the dust. Refugees whispered his name in underground bunkers. Resistance cells, once divided, began to unify again. Hope, once gasping, began to breathe. And in the heart of it all stood Rey. She had failed to turn Kylo Ren. She had seen the depths of his pain and of her own, but she had also seen Luke Skywalker rise not in anger, but in purpose. He had chosen peace over pride, sacrifice over revenge. That choice lived in her now. Rey returned to the Resistance carrying more than news. She carried the spark. Leia felt it instantly. The Force moved around Rey differently now, not as a storm, but as a current. Steady, clear. A light forged in trial, tempered by loss, and with her, the Jedi texts. Unknown to Luke, Rey had taken the ancient volumes from the tree on Ahch-To before Yoda's fire touched the bark. The sacred texts survived, not in flames, but in the hands of a student who read them not as rules, but as guides. She studied them in quiet hours aboard the Falcon, learned techniques long forgotten, listened to the Force in stillness, not just struggle. She began to train, herself and others, not as a master, not as a knight, but as a witness to what Luke had become. She remembered his lessons, his doubts, his failures, and his final truth. The Jedi are not perfect, but they are needed. She lit her saber, a blade with a golden core forged from the broken pieces of what came before. And then, something more. She felt him, Luke. Not in words, not in visions, but in presence. A peace that echoed through the Force when she meditated. A silent hand on her shoulder when she was afraid. A whisper of calm in moments of decision. He was with her now, not as a voice, but as a path. The Resistance began to grow again. Luke's story was told in secret rebel meetings, in cantinas, in the dark alleys of occupied cities, a myth, a message, that even in the face of hopelessness, one light could hold back the dark. He faced them alone. He never struck a blow. He didn't even flinch. It didn't matter whether every detail was true. What mattered was that people believed again. And through that belief, the Jedi were returning, not as warriors, not as servants of governments, but as guardians of balance. Rey began to travel. She searched for more Force sensitives, children, refugees, wanderers. She helped where she could. She defended where she must. But above all, she remembered Luke's final choice, that the power of the Jedi was not in what they fought, but in why they stood. And in a galaxy still healing, that was enough. The Force does not forget those who live with purpose. They do not vanish. They become the silence between stars. Luke Skywalker died on a stone island beneath twin suns, but he did not fade. The Force took him, not as a soul extinguished, but as a presence transformed. Where once he walked among the living, now he existed between all things, not bound by time, not bound by flesh, only aware. He had become what Yoda and Obi-Wan had before him, a whisper, a guide, a piece of the Force that still moved, still taught, still cared. To some, this was myth, but to Rey, it was real. She felt him often, in the quiet moments between stars, in the hush before battle, in dreams shaped not by fear, but by balance. He did not appear with fire and lightning. He came in stillness, in memory. After the Resistance's final victory, after the fall of Palpatine on Exile, after the end of the Sith's last shadow, Rey stood beneath a dawning sky on Tatooine. She walked among the sands of Lars homestead, the place where Luke's journey had begun. She buried 2 sabers, Leia's and Luke's, side by side in the sand, under a sky that had seen Skywalker's rise and fall, not in defeat, but in peace. As she stood alone, an old woman approached. "Who are you?" she asked. Rey looked to the horizon. She saw Luke and Leia, not as ghosts, but as warmth, as belonging. She smiled. Rey, Skywalker. And in that name, the story did not end. It continued. Luke's legacy lived not in monuments or orders, not in empires or bloodlines, but in choices, in the quiet strength of those who would stand when others fled, in kindness, in courage, in the refusal to let darkness define destiny. His name became something more than a history. It became a hope. Rey rebuilt what had been lost, but not in the image of the old Jedi. She studied the texts Luke had preserved. She remembered his teachings and his mistakes. She taught students to listen, to question, to feel, not just to follow. She trained Jedi not as soldiers, but as seekers. And in this new temple, Luke Skywalker was never truly gone. Sometimes Rey would sense him nearby. She would walk into the dunes at sunset or sit beneath the stars and close her eyes, and there, in the golden light and shifting wind, she would hear him. Not in commands, but in presence. "You are not me," his voice once said. "You are more. You are everything we tried to be, and more." The galaxy moved forward. New stars were born. New Jedi took their first steps. And in the gentle current that bound all life, Luke Skywalker drifted, peaceful, luminous, eternal. Not as a warrior, not even as a master, but as what he had always hoped to be, a light in the dark. Part Twimmed, The Philosophy of a Jedi. The Force is not a weapon. It is not a rule. It is a question whispered into the silence, and a choice in how we answer. Luke Skywalker's journey began with wonder. As a young man on Tatooine, he imagined the Force as something distant, mythic, a power used by heroes and villains alike, a mysterious strength whispered about in old stories and quiet warnings. When Obi-Wan Kenobi first spoke of it, Luke listened with wide eyes. But understanding came slowly and painfully, through war, through loss, through confrontation with darkness, both within others and within himself. His early view of the Force was binary, light versus dark, Jedi versus Sith, good versus evil. That was the legacy he inherited. The tale the galaxy had told itself since the fall of the Republic. And for a time, Luke lived by that simplicity. He trained under Yoda, who spoke of serenity, detachment, discipline, and under Obi-Wan, who taught that the dark side was a path to destruction. Luke trusted them. He followed their lessons. He confronted his father, believing he must destroy Darth Vader. But it was in choosing not to kill that Luke first stepped into his own path. That moment on the second Death Star, when he threw away his lightsaber rather than strike down his father, was more than rebellion. It was the foundation of a new Jedi philosophy. I am a Jedi, like my father before me. That statement became the start of his truth, not in blood, but in belief. Years later, as he sought to rebuild the Jedi, Luke began to see the Force as something more complex. He no longer believed in the rigid codes of the old temple. He questioned detachment, questioned blind discipline, questioned whether the old Jedi had helped cause their own downfall by refusing to change. In his studies, Luke uncovered lost texts, hidden doctrines, and ancient Force philosophies that predated the Republic. On Ahto and Ossus, in Whispers and Holocrons, he found stories of Jedi who embraced balance, not dominance. Some meditated on emotion, not fear of it. Some walked both light and dark, not as enemies, but as intertwined truths. Some served not governments, but life itself. Luke began to teach these ideas gently, cautiously. He told his students that the Force was not a ladder to climb, but a current to listen to, that it did not belong to Jedi or Sith, that it was life, connection, compassion, responsibility. He taught that strength without understanding led only to destruction, that anger must be faced, not hidden, that power must be balanced by humility. But these beliefs came with cost. The more he embraced this evolving philosophy, the more he feared whether it was enough. He saw Ben Solo grow strong, but also divided. He feared he had made the Jedi too soft, or too open, or too uncertain. In Exile, Luke would come to question everything. He told Rey that the Jedi must end, that their legacy was failure, not wisdom, that their blindness had enabled the rise of Darth Sidious, that their traditions had broken Anakin, that even he had failed to live up to what they were meant to be. But Rey challenged him. She saw in his despair not truth, but pain. She saw the same force he had once spoken of as life. She reminded him that light does not need permission to shine. And in the end, Luke agreed. He returned to the Force, not as a weapon, but as a teacher once more. His final act was not to strike, but to stand, not to conquer, but to inspire, to show the galaxy that the Force was still with them. Luke's philosophy was not bound in doctrine. It was not a new code etched in stone. It was a belief, grown through trial, that the Force is not a side to be chosen, but a mirror to be faced. And that balance is not found in silence, but in compassion. Part SWOT, Legends and Legacy. The truth is rarely remembered, but a story lives forever. Luke Skywalker never sought fame. When he destroyed the Death Star, the galaxy cheered his name, When he led missions for the Rebel Alliance, commanders spoke of his bravery with awe. When he faced Darth Vader and returned alive, his name became more than a soldier's. It became a symbol. But Luke never quite understood the attention. He saw the cheers, the admiration, the reverence. But inside, he was still the boy from Tatooine who had once dreamed of something more, staring at twin suns with sand on his boots. The galaxy needed heroes, and so it made one out of him. The legend of Luke Skywalker grew fast and grew strange. In one version, he single-handedly slew Darth Vader atop the spires of Coruscant. In another, he tamed a rancor with a wave of his hand and spoke the language of stars. In Baroom's, pilots claimed to have flown beside him during battles he'd never attended. In war zones, resistance fighters kept lucky charms etched with his name. To some, he was a Jedi god. To others, a mysterious ghost, appearing where he was needed most. To the First Order, he became a figure of terror, a remnant of the old rebellion, still capable of undoing everything. But the man behind the myth remained painfully human. Luke never corrected the tales, not because he believed them, but because he didn't know how to. And perhaps, deep down, he hoped the stories might serve someone else, might give strength where his own words could not. Yet the weight of the legend grew heavy. How do you teach when your students fear disappointing a myth? How do you warn about the dark side when people expect you to defeat it in a single breath? How do you face failure when the galaxy only sees your victories? Ben Solo once asked him, "Do you ever feel like they love a version of you that never existed?" Luke said nothing, because he did. When his Jedi school fell and Ben turned, the myth became a weapon. It shattered under the truth that even legends make mistakes, that even Jedi fall short, and so Luke vanished. And in his absence, the galaxy grew louder with stories. Some believed he had gone mad. Others claimed he had been assassinated by Sith loyalists. A few whispered that he had simply ascended, become one with the Force, and now watched the galaxy from the stars. By the time Rey found him on Ahch-To, the name Luke Skywalker was barely human. It was a tale carried by frightened voices and fading memories. She expected a warrior. She found a man, broken, silent, alone. But even in his exile, the legend waited. It lingered like an echo waiting to be remembered. And when he returned on Crait facing the First Order, he did not return as Luke the man. He returned as the legend, unarmed, unshaken. He stood against fire and fury. He bowed to no blade. He became the story the galaxy needed again. And in doing so, he gave that story to someone else, to Rey, to the next generation, to the children who would dream not of Luke Skywalker saving the galaxy, but of becoming someone who could. In time, his name would pass into history, but his legacy would not be a statue. It would be a choice, to stand when it's easier to fall, to believe when no one else does, to carry peace in a world that only remembers war. That was the real Luke Skywalker, not a hero who never failed, but one who did and kept going. Part 3. There are bonds the Force does not explain. Some are written in blood, others in shared silence. Luke and Leia were born into darkness. They had no memory of their mother, no lullabies, no childhood together. At birth, they were separated, hidden from the Empire, from the Emperor, and from each other. One raised as a princess, the other as a farm boy. Their lives shaped by different stars, different scars, and yet the Force remembered. When they first met aboard the Death Star amidst metal corridors and falling blaster fire, they did not know they were family, but something flickered beneath the surface. A pull. A quiet recognition that ran deeper than mission or duty. That connection would only grow. On Endor, after Luke told her the truth that Vader was his father and hers too, Leia was silent, not out of disbelief, but because somewhere she already knew. The Force had whispered to her in ways she hadn't always understood. Now it spoke with clarity. Their bond became something rare, not just familial, not just Jedi. Luke and Leia were the last living children of Anakin Skywalker, his final legacy, forged in rebellion rather than empire. And in their love for each other, they became the galaxy's quiet redemption. Where Luke walked the path of the Jedi, Leia chose another. She led, she rebuilt, she gave the galaxy stability after years of chaos. But even then, the Force stirred in her. Luke offered to train her, to show her the ways of the Jedi, not as doctrine, but as understanding. For a time, she accepted, and for a time, she was brilliant. She constructed her own lightsaber, learned how to see through the Force, how to feel it moving through all things. But something changed, something Luke would never resent, but would always respect. She stepped away. Leia had a vision, one that showed her death in the path of the Jedi and the fall of her son. And so she made a mother's choice. She laid down the saber, not out of fear, but out of love. Luke never pushed her. He told her the saber would wait, that the Force would still walk with her, even if she never touched it again. Their paths diverged, but their bond never weakened. Even when Luke vanished, even when he disappeared into exile, Leia never stopped believing in him. She never cursed him, never tried to drag him back, because she understood something most others didn't. Luke didn't run to hide. He ran to protect. When Rey came to Leia with Luke's lightsaber in hand, Leia took it with reverence. She knew then that her brother was still with them, somehow, somewhere. And when Luke appeared to her on Crait moments before his final stand, they didn't need to say much. Their goodbye was not in words. It was in presence, in knowing. "No one's ever really gone," he said. Leia smiled, because she knew. Later, when she passed into the Force, she joined him, not as ghostly figures frozen in legend, but as light, as family, as peace. Luke and Leia's bond was never about destiny. It was about choice. Two children born into a galaxy at war who chose to fight not for power, but for hope. In life, they walk different roads. In the Force, they are together, always. We carry more than our names. We carry the echoes of those who bore them before us. When Luke Skywalker looked at his reflection in the still waters of Ahch-To, he did not see a Jedi. He saw a son, not the son of Owen and Beru, though he loved them as dearly as any child could, but the son of a man whose name had become myth and nightmare. Anakin Skywalker. For much of his youth, Luke had no knowledge of his father. He knew only that he was a pilot, a great one, killed in the wars. That's what he was told. That's what he believed. And he clung to that image, imagined his father as a noble warrior, brave and bold. That hope gave him strength when his world turned to ash. But the truth came like a blade. Darth Vader, the Iron Mask, the shadow of death, the monster who hunted his friends, was his father. And in that moment, Luke felt something deeper than pain. Fear. What if that darkness lived in him too? What if the name Skywalker was not a light to follow, but a curse to survive? He could not speak it aloud at first, could not bear it. He pushed harder, trained longer, believed that if he was good enough, he could prove himself different. But the Force doesn't lie. It sees what we hide. On Dagobah, in the Cave of Visions, Luke faced a phantom Vader, and when the mask broke open, it was his own face beneath it. Yoda said nothing at first, only watched. Because the lesson was not about Vader, it was about choice. Luke didn't understand until the end, until he stood before the Emperor, lightsaber trembling, and felt the pull of rage, vengeance, blood. He heard his father's breathing in his own chest. He saw the same fire rising in himself, and yet he refused. He threw away his weapon, not in weakness, but in freedom. I am a Jedi like my father before me. With those words, Luke did something Anakin could not. He reached through the mask. He spoke to the man, not the monster. And for one brief moment, Anakin answered. That redemption shaped Luke's destiny. Not because he saved his father, Keefton Frye, but because he proved something true. The Skywalker name was not bound by the past. It could still choose the future. But even after that moment, the shadow of Anakin never left. When Luke rebuilt the Jedi, he often questioned whether his bloodline was more burden than gift. He watched Ben Solo grow, his nephew, his student, and saw too many reflections of Anakin's anger, Anakin's sorrow, Anakin's power. And in that fear, Luke faltered. For a moment, a terrible heartbeat, he considered striking Ben down in his sleep, not out of hatred, but to prevent another fall. That moment destroyed everything, because in that flash of weakness, he became the very thing he feared. A Skywalker ruled by fear. And so Luke ran, to forget, to disappear, to break the chain of the name once and for all. But the Force never let him forget, because Luke, despite his failures, was more than Anakin, not because he was stronger, but because he faced the darkness and chose not to fall. And in doing so, he showed others the same path. Rey, Leia, even Ben in the end. Luke's legacy was never about how far he rose, but how often he returned from the brink. That is what Skywalker came to mean, not power, but resilience. Not destiny, but the ability to say, this is who I was, but this is who I choose to be. And that truth, earned through pain, through silence, through peace, was the gift he passed on. The weight of the name did not crush him. In the end, he carried it into light. A Jedi does not begin as a warrior. They begin as a question, what will I do with this light? When Luke Skywalker began his Jedi Academy, he did not seek disciples. He sought hope. He traveled alone for years, through forgotten temples, buried archives, and half-lit Force visions, searching not for power, but for people. People like him. People who felt the Force not as a weapon, but as a calling. He found them quietly. Some were children, rescued from ruined villages or enslaved cities, unsure why they could hear the thoughts of others or move objects without touching them. Others were older, pilots, farmers, or drifters, who had spent years hiding their abilities, fearing the Empire's purge. Luke welcomed them all. He did not wear Jedi robes in those early days. He wore what he had always worn, simple clothes, travel-worn boots, the saber on his belt never drawn without need. He did not preach, he listened. Each student came with questions, and Luke tried to offer something the old Jedi had forgotten: space to grow. His academy was not built in Coruscant's gleaming towers. It stood in nature, atop a lush green hill surrounded by whispering trees and open sky. There were no rigid ranks, no titles, just the Force and the silence to understand it. Some of the names we know. Vo, passionate and strong, often frustrated by rules. Hennix, quiet, deeply intellectual, fascinated by the mechanics of the Force. Gentle and empathetic, able to sense emotions more clearly than most. And of course, Ben Solo, his most gifted and most burdened student. There were others, many whose names never reached legend, but whose hearts were just as devoted. They built their own sabers, learned from ancient texts, trained not to fight, but to feel. Luke did not teach them to fear the dark. He taught them to understand it. He reminded them that the Force is not about control, but harmony. That power is only sacred when wielded with restraint. For a time, it worked. The academy thrived, the students bonded, they trained in pairs, meditated beneath starlight, studied Force healing, elemental alignment, and even the ancient contemplative traditions of the early Jedi monks. Some began to show signs of deep ability, premonition, battle insight, even Force projection. Luke believed that if the Order was to rise again, it would do so differently, not as an arm of government, but as guardians of balance. But not all harmony lasts. Ben struggled. Not in power, but in peace. The other students saw it. Some feared him, some envied him, most admired him, especially Ty, who reached out in friendship even as Ben began to withdraw. Then the temple burned. The details remain debated. Some say Ben destroyed it in anger. Others say he tried to flee and the destruction followed. What we know is this: when it was over, most of the students were gone. Some died, trapped in the fire or caught in the collapse. Some fled, scattered across the stars, choosing silence over confrontation. And some, the darkest rumor says, followed Ben. Whether out of fear, loyalty, or belief, no one knows. Luke stood among the ruins. He searched for survivors. For days, he used the Force to reach out. But what he felt was emptiness. He had built something beautiful, something fragile, and it had shattered. The students were his family, his legacy, and their loss became his greatest sorrow. Yet not all was lost. Some still remained, hidden across the galaxy, Force sensitives who had left before the fall or escaped in the aftermath. Their stories are quiet, whispered in corners of resistance cells or forgotten libraries. And one day, others would rise. Rey would carry the torch, but the students Luke taught, even if unnamed, would carry a piece of his wisdom forever. Because the Jedi are not a building, they are seeds. And even if burned to ash, some seeds wait and grow again. Part 6's Trials of the Mind. The greatest battles are not fought with sabers, they are fought in silence, between fear and hope. Luke Skywalker knew how to fight with a blade. He had trained under Yoda in the ancient forms, faced down Darth Vader, defended his students from countless threats. But the most difficult enemies he ever faced could not be touched. They lived within him. The dark side was never far. Not in the dramatic sense, not a mask or red blade, but something subtler. A question that returned again and again. What if I'm wrong? From the moment he learned the truth about his father, Luke understood that the path of a Jedi was not just about what to do, but what not to become. He feared becoming Anakin. He feared failing like the Jedi before him. He feared believing in someone who would betray him again. And slowly, quietly, that fear began to eat at him. Even as a teacher, he second-guessed his decisions. He saw Ben Solo's strength and felt pride, but also worry. He remembered how the Council once celebrated Anakin Skywalker, how they missed the signs. Could he be doing the same? At night, Luke sometimes dreamt of the Jedi Temple aflame before it ever burned. He saw Ben's face in the dark, twisted not by hatred, but by sorrow. He awoke not screaming, but silent, because the visions didn't feel like dreams. They felt like warnings, and so the pressure grew. He studied endlessly, searching the oldest texts for answers, signs that the Jedi once foresaw this. He found nothing, only silence. The more he searched, the more uncertain he became. Even the Force began to feel distant. It didn't abandon him, but it no longer gave clear answers. What once moved like instinct now felt like doubt, like an echo waiting for words that would not come. His greatest trial came in that one moment, standing in the doorway of Ben's chamber, sensing the darkness rising, seeing a vision of what Ben might become, death, destruction, the fall of everything. His saber ignited, not out of rage, but instinct. And in that instant, he saw himself in a way he never had before, as the threat. He extinguished the blade just as quickly, but it was too late. The damage was done. The student he tried to save fled. The temple burned. The order fell. And Luke Skywalker, the last Jedi, was left with his mind. That was the cruelest battlefield of all. He wandered, searching for meaning, for absolution, not from others, but from the voice in his own head. The voice that whispered, "You failed," like they all did. When he reached Ahch-To, he didn't come for peace. He came for silence. He cut himself off from the Force, not out of anger, but shame. He believed that if he stopped listening, the guilt might fade. But the Force is not so easily silenced. Even without connection, it lingered, in the wind, in the sea, in the tree that held the sacred texts, in Rey's presence when she finally arrived. She brought questions. He gave her resistance, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. He feared repeating the cycle again. He feared handing the Force to someone who might break under its weight. He feared hope, because hope had once led him into fire. But hope came anyway, in Rey's words, in her strength, in her defiance. She challenged the silence, and the silence broke. Yoda's spirit arrived not to punish, but to remind that failure is not the end of the path. It is the path. Luke had spent years fighting that truth, trying to be a perfect Jedi, a perfect teacher, a perfect symbol, only to discover that his imperfections were what made him worthy. And in that realization, the war within him, quiet, unseen, relentless, began to end. He reconnected with the Force, not as a master, as a man. And in doing so, he faced his greatest trial and passed. Luke and the Lost Jedi, the past is not gone, it waits in silence for those willing to listen without pride. Long before Luke Skywalker stood alone on Ahch-To, he had wandered the galaxy searching for the Jedi that had once been. Not the Council, not the war generals of the Clone Wars, but the original Jedi. The Seekers, the Watchers, the mystics who touched the Force when it was still new to the galaxy. He knew the stories of Coruscant's great temple, of the archives lost in fire, of the Council's fall. But those were the final chapters, not the beginning. Luke believed that if the Jedi were to rise again, they had to do so from the roots, not the ruins. And so he searched, not with armies, not with fleets, but alone. He followed broken star maps, studied whispers in the Force, listened to old pilots and dusty librarians, to Force-sensitive children and ancient trees that still hummed with memory. His journey led him through forgotten worlds, Jeddah, where the Guardians of the Whills had once watched over sacred crystals, believing the Force was not a power but a breath, a gift. Ossus, once home to the great Jedi library, now scattered to wind and moss. Tython, the rumored birthplace of Jedi thought, where light and dark were studied not as opposites, but as necessary halves. He walked through stone ruins and felt echoes, not of battle, but of meditation, of monks who sat in stillness for days, watching how the Force moved through stars, animals, and each other. They did not fight. They did not command. They listened. Luke was changed. He had been trained to use the Force, to reach for it, to push and pull. But now he learned to let it move through him. He began to understand that mastery did not come from control, but from surrender. He found teachings that spoke of balance, not conquest, that warned of both fear and certainty, that taught compassion was the highest strength, that reminded him even light, when used without understanding, could blind. He collected these lessons in memory and in ink. When he found Ahch-To, he discovered the first Jedi temple, carved into the cliffs, weathered by time, kept by silent, fish-like caretakers who remembered the order long after its end. There he found the sacred Jedi texts, worn, dense, written in ancient tongues. They held prayers, philosophies, rituals never taught by the Republic's Jedi, ideas that made Luke question everything he thought he knew. He studied for years, not seeking power, not even purpose, but truth. In one passage, a nameless master wrote, "To be Jedi is not to serve the light, it is to serve the balance. Light without humility becomes tyranny. Darkness without compassion becomes chaos. The Force is not a side, it is a circle." Luke copied those words into his own journals. By the time Rey arrived, he had come to believe something few others had dared to say, that the Jedi Order, for all its wisdom, had lost its way, that in trying to defeat the dark, they had forgotten to understand it. This belief is what made him cautious with Rey, not because he doubted her spirit, but because he feared passing on the same incomplete story. He told her the Jedi needed to end, but what he meant in truth was that they needed to begin again. He hoped that in her hands, these ancient truths might live anew, not as commandments, but as questions, not as law, but as wisdom. Luke Skywalker was not the last Jedi. He was the bridge between what was and what could be. He did not rebuild the old ways, he rediscovered the forgotten ones, and in doing so, he gave the Jedi a chance, not to return to power, but to return to purpose. A lightsaber is not a weapon, it is a reflection. It hums with who we are, and sometimes who we are afraid to become. The first time Luke Skywalker ignited a lightsaber, it wasn't his. It hummed with blue light, steady, bright, powerful. Obi-Wan placed it in his hands with quiet reverence. "Your father wanted you to have this when you were old enough." It was Anakin's saber, a relic of a man Luke did not yet understand, and a symbol of a path he had not yet chosen. The blade was elegant, clean, its hilt scarred only by time. Luke trained with it, learned its weight, defended his friends with it. It became his identity before he ever truly found his own. That saber followed him across fire and snow, through loss and revelation, until Cloud City, where his hand was severed, and with it the blade fell, lost, or so he thought. Years later, it would find its way into Rey's hands. But Luke would never wield that blade again. His second saber, he built himself. A green-bladed weapon, constructed in secrecy between Empire and Jedi. In the shadows of Tatooine's caves, he assembled the hilt. He had studied old Jedi texts and fragments left behind by Obi-Wan and Yoda. This saber was simpler, more personal. Its crystal, Kyber, attuned to him not with aggression, but clarity. When he first ignited it, its glow bathed him in green light, a symbol of the consular path, the Jedi whose role was not war, but peacekeeping, diplomacy, teaching. Perhaps it chose him, or perhaps, unconsciously, he chose it. It was this saber Luke carried into Jabba's palace, this saber that ignited on Endor, this saber that faced Darth Vader and the Emperor. And when he threw that saber aside in defiance, not to fight but to save his father, it became something else, not a blade of power, but a blade of choice. After the Battle of Endor, Luke kept the saber with him during his travels. It became his companion on pilgrimages to ancient temples, on missions to seek out Force-sensitive individuals, and in the building of his Jedi Academy. But in time, its meaning changed. When his students fell, when Ben Solo turned, the saber was no longer a symbol of hope. It became a memory of failure. We do not know if he ever wielded it again. Some believe he placed it on the altar of the Jedi tree. Others say he cast it into the sea. But when Rey arrived on Ahch-To, she did not bring him the green saber. She brought the blue one, Anakin's saber, recovered from Maz Kanata's keeping, the blade he lost, the blade that began it all. He refused it, because to him it was no longer a gift. It was a wound. But Rey carried it anyway. She wielded it not because it was perfect, but because it meant something. It was heritage, a reminder of the choices made by those before her. And in time, she repaired it, after it cracked during the conflict between her and Kylo Ren. And still, Luke returned. When he projected himself to Crait to confront the First Order and face his fallen student, he did not appear with the green saber, the one he still held, the one that reflected his maturity. No, he appeared with the blue, the saber that meant hope, the saber that meant origin, the saber that meant he still believed, even in death. It wasn't about the blade. It was about what the blade meant to others. Later, Rey would bury both Luke and Leia's sabers on Tatooine, the green and the blue, beneath the twin suns. And she would ignite a new blade, her own, golden, pure, made from the staff that had carried her since childhood. Luke's legacy wasn't in the saber she used. It was in the choice she made with it. Because a lightsaber is not just a weapon, it is a mirror. And Luke's sabers told the story of a boy, a warrior, a teacher, and finally, a soul who chose peace. A master does not hand down power. A master leaves behind the courage to make one's own path. When Rey first climbed the stone steps of Ahch-To, she was not looking for a teacher. She was looking for hope. She carried the weight of a saber she did not understand. She had felt the awakening of the Force but didn't know its language. The Resistance was dying. Leia had no Jedi left, and the galaxy whispered only one name: Luke Skywalker. But the man she found was not the one she had imagined. He was quiet, bitter, wounded by memory and unwilling to rise. He refused the saber she offered him. He answered her questions with silence. He saw in her raw power and behind it the same terrifying potential he once saw in Ben Solo. Rey was furious. She had grown up waiting for belonging, for answers. And now the last Jedi stood before her and offered her nothing. But Luke did offer something. Slowly. Not answers, but truth. In her persistence, he agreed to teach her 3 lessons, not in lightsaber drills or force throws, but in observation, philosophy, and challenge. Lesson 1, that the Force does not belong to the Jedi, that it surrounds all life, not as a power to control, but a balance to understand. Rey listened. She reached out, and she felt it. Life and death, peace and rage, warmth and cold. She felt everything. Lesson 2, that the Jedi had failed, that their arrogance helped birth the Empire, that even their greatest heroes could fall. Luke showed her how the Order had become blind, too focused on the light to see the truth. Lesson 3 was never fully given, because Rey left. She saw that Luke was still running, from his mistakes, from the Force, from the past. She believed she could do what he no longer would. Face Ben Solo, turn him back, save him. But Luke had tried that, and it nearly destroyed them both. In truth, Luke was afraid that the Force had become too wild to shape, afraid that training Rey would lead to another fall, afraid that his legend had done more harm than good. But it was Rey who reminded him of who he truly was. She brought him back to the mirror, not with power, but with compassion. Even when they clashed, even when she struck in frustration, she did not hate him. She needed him to remember that the light still mattered. And Luke, in time, did. When he appeared on Crait to face the First Order, not with violence, but as a symbol, Rey felt it through the Force. He was not there to fight. He was there to teach. And the lesson? That one Jedi could stand unafraid, that peace could be stronger than fear, that the spark must be protected, no matter how small it seemed. After Luke's passing, Rey carried those lessons with her. She trained in the old ways, but with her own questions. She studied the sacred texts. She listened not only to the Force, but to the stillness between its movements, where Luke's presence remained. In moments of silence, she felt him, not in commands, not in answers, but in calm. Luke's guidance became part of her. He had not shaped her like a master shapes an apprentice. He had not imposed his path onto hers. He had shown her who not to be, and in doing so, helped her find who she was. Later, on Tatooine, she would bury his saber beside Leia's, and when asked her name, she would not answer simply Rey. She would answer Rey Skywalker. Not because she inherited Luke's blood, but because she inherited his light. What could have been? The Force does not promise perfection, only possibility. There are stories, and then there are questions. Luke Skywalker lived a life full of choice, some brave, some flawed, all of them real. But across the quiet corridors of the Force, echoes remain. What could have been if only one step had been taken differently? Not to rewrite his legend, but to understand it. Let us walk, briefly, through the mights, the maybes, the roads not taken. What if Luke had struck Vader down? In the Emperor's throne room, lightsaber raised, vengeance coursing through his veins, Luke stood poised to deliver the final blow. In one universe, he cast away the saber. In another, he brings it down. The galaxy sees a new Emperor rise, not Palpatine, but Skywalker. A Jedi twisted by grief, tricked by power, slowly reborn as something darker. His victory becomes corruption, and his name becomes a warning. Leia, already strong in the Force, chose to lay down the lightsaber to protect her son. But what if she hadn't? What if Luke had trained her to full Jedi mastery years before Ben Solo was ever tempted? Perhaps she could have reached Ben in ways Luke could not. Perhaps the Order would have had two pillars, brother and sister, light and wiser light. Perhaps Rey would never need to fight alone. But Leia's destiny was always of a different kind, and Luke understood that. What if Luke never tried to rebuild the Jedi? In the wake of the Empire's fall, Luke could have walked away. He could have lived quietly, never taking students, never opening himself to more loss. And yet, the Force would not have stayed silent. Without a new Jedi Order, the galaxy would have remained without balance. Sensitive children would have grown untrained, unprotected, ripe for darkness. The Force demands action, not avoidance. Luke had to try, even knowing he might fail. What if he never left Ahto? Rey came, offered him the saber, begged him to return. He refused. But imagine if he never changed his mind, never reconnected with the Force, never projected himself to Crait. The Resistance might have died that day. No escape, no spark, no hope. And Rey, left without guidance, might never have found her center. Wasn't about defeating an army. It was about reminding the galaxy that courage was still alive. What if Luke lived? This may be the hardest one. If Luke had survived Ahto, if the strain of his projection hadn't claimed his life, he might have fought beside Rey on Exile, might have helped rally more Jedi, might have trained a new generation with his own hands. But would the galaxy have listened? Or would it have looked only to Luke, again, to save it? By passing into the Force, Luke allowed something more powerful to rise, a new beginning. These possibilities linger like stardust in the Force. But Luke Skywalker's truth is not in what might have been. It is in what was, a farm boy who became a legend, and then a man again. One who made mistakes, one who tried, one who never stopped believing that the light, no matter how faint, was worth protecting. And in the end, that was enough.